Welcome to the Explainer. Today we are diving straight into a geopolitical firestorm brewing up in the Arctic. We're talking about the United States threatening to invade one of its own allies. Yeah, you heard that right. This is pushing the entire Western alliance right to the brink.
So, could the US actually invade an ally? Well, back in early 2026, a pretty shocking threat from the White House made that question very, very real. The focus? Two absolutely key Arctic nations, Greenland and Iceland. And look, this is way more than just some diplomatic argument. It's a challenge to the very idea of the Western alliance itself.
Okay, so let's break this down. First up, the Arctic standoff. This is really a story of the US versus the EU. We're going to look at who's involved and the pretty blunt threats that kicked this whole thing off.
It really starts with President Trump calling control over these Arctic territories an absolute necessity. Not just a good idea, but a necessity for U.S. national security. And just that one statement, boom, tensions with America's closest allies in Europe went through the roof. And how do you try to force Denmark's hand on Greenland? Well, the U.S. threatened a massive 25% import tax, and not just on Denmark, on all goods coming from the entire European Union. We're talking about economic hardball on a scale that is just huge.
Okay, but this is where it gets really wild. The administration actually said, and I'm quoting here, that it has no obligation to think purely of peace. They flat out refused to rule out military action. Think about that for a second. That kind of talk just rips up the rulebook for Western alliances. It puts the threat of force on the table between allies.
So, how did the EU respond? Swiftly, and with a single clear voice. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, came out and declared full solidarity with the Nordic nations. The message was simple: their sovereignty is not up for debate. Period. And you know, the EU wasn't just bringing words to this fight. They've got a pretty powerful tool of their own. It's called the anti-coercion instrument. But get this, its nickname is the trade bazooka. And it does exactly what it sounds like. It lets them fire back with massive tariffs of their own in an economic fight like this. And this right here is the critical turning point. This whole thing jumped from an economic threat to a military one. We're talking about major NATO players, the UK, France, Germany, teaming up with Iceland. They formed something called Operation Arctic Endurance, and they started moving military forces into the area, specifically to defend it from a potential US move. So, to really get why the pushback is so incredibly strong, you have to understand Iceland's history. We're talking about a long, tough road to independence. This isn't just about current politics for them, it's deeply personal.
I mean, just look at this timeline. Iceland's whole story is one long fight for self-rule. First, it was Norwegian control way back in 1262. Then, hundreds of years under the Danish crown. Even during World War II, they were occupied by the Allies. They have been fighting for their autonomy forever. So you can imagine what a huge deal it was when they finally became a republic in 1944. All of that history, that's exactly why sovereignty is something they will not compromise on. It's just baked into their national identity.
Okay, so that history really sets the stage for why we're seeing two completely different ways of looking at this crisis. Let's dive into how these two worldviews are clashing head-on. Right, so this really lays out the two sides of the coin. From the US perspective, this is all about national security, right? Pushing back against Russia and China. But for the EU and Nordic countries, it's about something more fundamental: sovereignty. Their borders can't just be ignored. The US is looking at mineral rights and what they call the psychology of power. Meanwhile, the allies are saying, look, the democratic will of the people is to make America go away. And if you invade, that's it. That's the end of NATO as we know. But you might be wondering, why the Arctic? Of all places. And why is this all happening now? Well, it turns out this remote, icy part of the world is becoming incredibly important on the global stage. So, for a long time, this region has been absolutely central to Western naval strategy. It's called the GIU Gap. That stands for Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. And it's basically a giant strategic choke point. If you want to control who gets into the Atlantic Ocean, especially, say, Russian submarines, you have to control this gap. So what does control of this area really get you? Well, you get to control submarine traffic, you have the perfect spot for early warning missile defense bases, and this is a big one, you get to dominate the brand new shipping routes that are opening up because of melting ice. On top of all that, it's a major front in hybrid warfare, disinformation, political meddling, all designed to drive a wedge between the allies.
Which brings us to the big final question here. What's really on the line? Because as you've probably figured out, this is about way more than just a piece of land or some resources.
What we're really looking at is a complete breakdown of trust. You have NATO's biggest, most powerful member facing off against its own allies. This isn't just a disagreement. It threatens to completely shatter the alliance that has kept the peace for 75 years. The entire security system of the post-war era is at risk. And so this whole mess leaves us with a pretty stark and unsettling question, one that really gets at the heart of what it means to be partners in the 21st century. I mean, if your allies can be bought off, or worse, invaded by their most powerful friend, then what's the point of an alliance anyway?